This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 600. Ta-da! Why Masculists hate Suzanne Venker and her ilk. Description. Suzanne Venker writes anti-feminist essays pushing young women to stay at home raising small children, and that husbands should be prepared to work for them. Of course, this is diametrically opposed to the goals of the Masculists, who push fluffies very hard to fip up or be punished severely by men, masculisted men, by not getting one. Masculists do agree, however, when the kids are pre-kindergarten, that the mother should stay at home full-time, raising them, and be given a government maternity wage. Masculists are abolitionists and push women hard to get off their fat parasitic arses and fip up, so that they do not manslave a man for decades of his life. Masculists propose the CMT, that's Career Mother Timeline, for women, so that they stay at home when the kids are small and return to being a FIP for the rest of their lives, not manslaving a man. Venker needs to become biconscious before her husband does, or she will risk him dumping her for her monoconscious bigotry, her belief that it is men's role to pay for women to have babies and to work for women for decades of men's lives, thus manslaving them. The flyer itself. Why Masculists hate Suzanne Venker and her ilk, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Suzanne Venker writes regular essays on the theme of anti-feminism, in the sense that she feels that the feminists have lied to women, that female careerism is everything, and that motherhood is to be denigrated. Venker lashes out at feminists on this, telling subscribers to her essays and videos that women have a deep, evolved need to be mothers, and need to have men who support them to stay at home, not work, and look after their babies and young children, then later get part-time work, etc. I'm a subscriber to her essays because I find them interesting, often intellectually challenging, and nearly always the opposite of what I believe is a masculist. So in that sense, there are times when I hate her. Her latest epistle is one of those times. Recently, she wrote an essay entitled, quote, "You got a degree for a reason," end quote. The first few paragraphs of which I'll copy here and then cut her to pieces as a masculist. Quote, I'll do this in female voice. "A young woman I know sent me a TikTok recently, one of those short POV clips, showing a stay-at-home mom explaining to her husband why she isn't bringing in an income despite having a master's degree. I'm hearing this same theme over and over again. Millennial and Gen Y wives having to justify to their husbands why they're not working or why they don't want to work post-baby. This is what 50 years of feminism has done. It should be patently obvious why a woman wants to raise the baby she brings into the world. That's how she's supposed to feel. It's called being normal. She should not have to explain either her desire to do so or the value of her doing so. And yet she must, because all men have heard their entire lives is how women want to live their lives the way men live theirs. All men have heard that it takes 2 incomes to survive. All men have heard is that women lose their identities if and when they stay home with their babies. Why wouldn't men need an explanation? I have a client right now in this exact boat, ... That's the end of the quote. You can read the rest of this essay and judge for yourself by clicking on the following link. Suzanne Venker, so that's S-U-Z or Z-A-N-E-V-E-N-K-E-R, that's all one word, suzannevenker.com/lean-out/ you-got-a degree-for-a-reason / Venker, like nearly all people of either sex, is monoconscious. That is, when it comes to gender politics, she has only had her feminist consciousness raised and knows nothing about masculism. That gender oppression is very much a two-way street, that women oppress men as well, and in fact worse than vice versa, since many of women's gender crimes against men last decades, that make them a lot more serious than the rather minor ways that men oppress women. She just takes it for granted that there will be some man in the background who will be willing to allow his wife not to work, to stay at home, raising her kids, while he works for her for decades of his life. The core idea of masculism is that it is diametrically opposed to this assumption of Venker's and of millions of other women, including most feminists. The core idea of masculism is that it is a rebellion by men against being man's slaves to women, working for women. The Masculists have a hatred of fluffies, who are, by definition, traditional women, who expect, like Venker, to be able to live off the money and labour of a man, thus manslaving him and divorce raping him, in 1 in 4 marriages with children, Venker needs to have her face slapped by a Masculist who lives in her area, which not surprisingly is in the Midwest of the US, which makes her a, flyover stater. That is rather conservative, so unsurprisingly she has rather traditional views when it comes to gender politics. Venker needs to learn some masculism so that she does not make the fundamental mistake that there are lots of men who are prepared to be manslaved and divorce raped, which is what happens to one father in 4 in the hated, fluffy feminist, hypocrite, genocider, dominated divorce court system. Masculists are very aware of the horrors of the divorce courts for fathers, so not surprisingly, in many Western countries now, 2/3 of young men refuse to marry and reject paternity, since they absolutely refuse to risk being butchered by these courts and prefer to live the MGTOW, MGTOW, men going their own way, lifestyle, rejecting marriage and paternity, and spending their money on themselves. Venker needs to learn that the supply of such gullible, stupid, man-slavable men is drying up, thanks to the existence of the manosphere, that's men talking about men's issues on the internet, who teach millions of men about the massive and hateable gender crimes that women commit against men, far worse than vice versa. For example, women's man-slavery, women's divorce rape, women's forced fathering, etc. If there were Masculists in the audience of her talks, when she makes the unquestioned assumption that there are men around who are prepared to be man-slaves to women, then they would quickly and rudely disabuse her of that belief, yelling at her that she is an apologist for man-slavery and hence an object of hatred by Masculists. They would tell her of the horrors of the fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts, which rip custody of a man's kids away from him with a 90% probability, give his house to her so she can raise her kids in it. He'll be forced to make payments to his kids, whom he will barely be allowed to see, maybe 2 weekends a month. He will lose half his stuff and half his wealth to her, and if she's a real fluffy, he may be forced to pay her alimony for the rest of his life, with no legal nor moral obligation on her to fit up and stop parasiting off him after the divorce the way she did before the divorce. Masculists are abolitionists and see man's slavery as a war issue. Masculists have a bitter hatred of fluffies and are at war with them, aiming to wipe them out by forcing them to rot on the shelf, dying a slow, miserable death by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them. Masculists put powerful moral pressure on women to get off their fat parasitic arses and fib up, or be severely punished by men, masculisted men in capitals, by not getting one. Masculists use the very powerful argument that it was men who created the enabling conditions that created feminism, that is, by giving women science-based medicine, so that women now have a life expectancy of 85 years. Men gave women the pill, so women now choose to have typically 0, 1 or 2 kids. Men gave women household gadgets and higher education, so now millions of women have poured into the workforce, since the alternative would have been to suffer ennui, rotting in the home for the rest of their long lives. Women now have a career window of half a century. The Masculists now stand up, point the finger at women and say, quote, "Now that women can work, you must work. Anything else is man's slavery, and man's slavery will get you killed slowly by being totally ignored by men, left to rot on the shelf." End quote. Now, let me backtrack a bit. I agree, as a masculist, that it's important when the kids are small that the mother should be there to raise them full time. So that means that to some extent I actually agree with Venker. So what is to be done from a masculist point of view? Obviously some form of compromise. Masculists want the creation of a FIP society, that is one in which both sexes are socialized to be FIPs. Masculists are very conscious that many of men's gender issues would be solved by living in a FIP society. So Masculists exert tremendous moral pressure on young women to FIP up or to rot on the shelf, spat at by Masculists. In the UK now, young men care more about the fitness level of a potential girlfriend than they do about her looks. So, how to have women stay at home raising small kids and have them being FIPs? By proposing that women, for example upper middle class women, live according to the CMT regime, that is the career mother timeline, which for an upper middle class woman goes as follows. She gets her master's at 23, works in her financially competent profession for 5 years and marries in that time. By the time she's 29, she has had her first kid, and by 31, her second. She stays full-time at home raising her 2 kids until the second kid is off to kindergarten when she is 35. She then starts working again at her financially competent profession so that she is not a man-slaving, divorce-raping parasite of her husband. The Masculists want governments to pay these mothers a mother wage so that the husband is not solely responsible for earning a living for the entire family himself, her and the 2 kids, which is a highly stressful situation for him. Venker needs to incorporate masculist thinking into her thinking, because at the moment she's making a fundamental mistake in believing that men are prepared to be man-slaves to fluffy, parasitical women. As most men become masculisted, those women who don't bother to FIP up will be ignored and hence severely punished, since they will rot on the shelf, spat at by most men, seen as being hated, man-slaving, divorce-raping, parasitic vermin to be exterminated, which is what masculists do to fluffies. Masculists are abolitionists. Fluffies are hated and the masculists are at war against them, aiming to wipe them off the face of the earth. A fluffy can only be a fluffy if she can get her financial claws into some gullible, stupid, ignorant, man-slavable man. But thanks to the masculists and MGTOWs, the supply of such men is drying up. So fluffies are forced by men to FIP up, or they rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and utterly rejected by society, spat at, vilified, rejected, pariahed. Masculists have a hatred of women who think that, quote, "Men exist on this earth to pay for women to have babies." We masculists bite the fucking heads off women who think like this, screaming at them that they are manslavers, divorce rapists, vermin, to be exterminated by men by them not getting one. As most men are masculisted, women will be forced, in capital letters, to FIP up, to grow up, to take responsibility for their own lives and not expect, fluffy style, to live off the money and labour of a man, thus man-slaving him for decades, the worst of all gender crimes. That is a war issue to masculists who slowly kill such women by totally ignoring them, spitting at them. It's a good thing that Venker is a flyover stater, living in the intellectual backwoods of the US, since she is surrounded by like-minded neighbours. But masculist ideas are spreading rapidly due to the power of the internet to transmit ideas. So Venker will need to update her gender political thinking to make herself more biconscious and abandon her unconscious, unquestioned assumption that there will always be man-slavable men around who will be prepared to work for fluffy, stay-at-home women for decades of their lives. The masculists are killing off this assumption by telling women that if they are not FIPS, then they will be manless and spat at. Young women now are increasingly panicking as they find with boyfriend after boyfriend that he refuses to give her his sperm, since he utterly rejects the one chance in 4 of being butchered in the hated, fluffy, feminist-dominated divorce court system and chooses to live the MGTOW lifestyle of rejecting marriage and paternity. The most he might do for a woman is to have a LAT relationship with her. LAT equals living apart together, equals 2 abodes, 2 FIPS, no marriage, no kids, so that when the relationship fails, they go back to their own abodes, cost-free to the man. Close brackets. Masculists are very conscious that fundamental changes need to be made to society. For example, GECs, that's GECs, Gender Equality Committees, need to be set up in the parliaments that consist half of female feminists and half of male masculists, so that the gender issues of both sexes are dealt with equally. The paternity rejection right needs to be legislated. Women have the mara, but men don't have the para, the greatest